Oleg Benesch is a historian, a senior lecturer at the University of York in the UK. It's either York University or University of York? Which one is it, Oleg?
University of York. York University is the one in Canada,
Yeah,
which
okay, University of York. And he writes books about samurais, about castles, and about emotions. Let me share, he has a website, and it is olegbenesch.com, and it's got we have information about his book, The Way of the Samurai, Inventing, The Way of the Samurai, Nationalism, Internationalism, and Bushido in Modern Japan, which came out in 2014 and paperback 2016. His book about Japan's castles, Citadels of Modernity and War and Peace, and the collection Civilizing Emotions, Concepts in 19th Century Asia and Europe. So, where shall we begin, Oleg? Which came first, the castles or the samurai or the martial arts or just an
oh
interest in Japan? Where did it all begin?
yeah, that's a good question. I guess I was born and raised in Alaska, which is, I think, for many people kind of surprisingly close to Japan. Alaska was one of the, I think it might have been the only part of the U.S. that was occupied by Japan in the Second World War. Um, but more so than that, I guess we always had very strong links with Japan. During the Cold War, the only way you could travel between Europe and East Asia, especially Japan, was through Anchorage, Alaska, because you couldn't fly over Soviet airspace. And so my family is German, and every year, growing up, we'd fly back to Germany, and we'd get in the plane in Anchorage, and it would be us and usually about 300 Japanese businessmen that would be flying over the pole. And so we always had these really strong connections with Japan and East Asia in general. And then at university, I studied philosophy for my undergraduate, and a lot of that was actually Chinese philosophy. I studied comparative philosophy, Chinese, and then got into Japanese philosophy as well. And then after university, I had quite a few Japanese friends and just decided to move to Japan. And I don't know, I ended up living there for about 6 years in total. Still go back quite frequently. But it was during that time in Japan that I started getting interested in some of the ideas I'm working on now. And I guess it's been about 20 years now since I started, especially working on Bushido, kind of the way of the samurai. And I guess I'm trying to think, reading various kind of samurai inspired, let's say, comic books, or, things like ninja were obviously everywhere in popular culture. Even something like the Ninja Turtles in the 90s. But then, one film that did actually quite stick with me was the film Ghost Dog.
Oh, yeah.
With Forrest Whitaker as, kind of this kind of mafia hitman who lives according to this book of the samurai. And I remember buying that book, which is the Hagakure, essentially, from early 18th century text, and reading that and being a bit confused, as I think just about everyone who reads the Hagakure is still a bit confused about it. And then just kind of digging a bit deeper, reading Nitobe Inazo's book Bushido, The Soul of Japan, which is quite famous, published around 1900, and just kind of getting more and more into this and kind of looking, what this actually means, and trying to figure out why it's so significant and really how old it is. And I think that's one of the things that's always interested me, is trying to get to the origins of things. And that, that if that's Bushido, if it's, martial arts as well, that's something in martial arts, obviously, where people are always looking for the origins. And then how, once you've gotten to those origins, how have we gotten from those origins to where those things are today? So, so I think came from kind of a big mix of things originally.
Okay. So, so with the samurai book, the people think of the samurai as ancient, and people conflate the idea of samurai with kamikaze, with some kind of essence of Japanese determination and commitment. But it's more complicated than that, isn't it? The argument in your work is is that there were processes of reinvention and kind of reimagining of Japanese identity, and the samurai became a figure of that at a certain point in relatively modern times. Is that
Mhm.
correct?
No, that's yeah, a very good summary, probably better one than I could give. But essentially, I think it's been in many people's interests throughout, the modern period, especially in the imperial period in Japan, so 1868 to 1945. There's been a lot of interest in trying to establish a continuity with kind of ancient martial ideals, and then the modern kind of, well, really the modern military would be the focal point of this. But that these supposedly ancient warriors, and you try to trace those back as far as you possibly can. You look at a lot of the texts from the early 20th century, and they're looking for the origins of Japan's martial ideals in kind of in the plane of high heaven and the age of the gods. That's not mentioned quite so frequently anymore. But people are trying to push it back as far as they can. And I mean, certainly we have warriors, we have swords, we have fighting, we have all these things going back really as far as you want to look. But when this kind of idea of a samurai as kind of a specific warrior emerges, that's a much kind of trickier issue. And I mean, we have people arguing for over a span of many centuries as to when they actually emerged. One thing, I mean, regardless of where we start, if we want to put the samurai in kind of the 9th century or the 12th century or the 14th century or the 16th century, one of the important things though is I think there is a key disconnect that happens in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, where there is kind of a break with whatever is there before. And so many of things, I mentioned the Hagakure, this book earlier, which is written in the early 18th century, and most of the things that we see as kind of the key texts of kind of Bushido or samurai ideology now are written in kind of the period between about 1600 and the 1850s, because this was essentially a period of peace. The samurai were largely bureaucrats rather than warriors, and they actually had time to think about what it was that set them apart from the rest of the population and why they were, on top of society. And they essentially justified this role by their kind of martial role, that they were these warriors who were role model for all of society. What that meant varied greatly, and there wasn't one kind of uniform code or samurai identity during that period at all. So we have a lot of different texts coming out during this time, but what we have then, especially with, I mentioned 1860s, 1870s, is there's quite a backlash against the old order, so to speak. After the Tokugawa shogunate is overthrown in 1868, there is a large movement towards westernization. People don't want to think about these kind of feudal relics anymore. Things like castles, for example, across Japan are torn down. No one really wants to have anything to do with the samurai anymore, and they're quite negatively portrayed. And then it's only really in the late 1880s and then in the 1890s that this past kind of gets rediscovered and reinvented. And that's actually in the 1890s is the first time that we really see this concept of Bushido coming up. I mean, the term is almost not used before that. So there's one or two texts that mention it a couple of times. But if you just said that to someone in 18th century Japan, they wouldn't have known what you're talking about.
So I mean, you connect it explicitly with nationalism. So it's about the emergence into like the modern world organized by the concept of the nation and international relations produced and trade organized in these terms as well. So is it the strong, like if you were to look at all the ingredients that go into the production of a Japanese sense of national identity in the 19th century and early 20th century, where would like how big and how important is the concept of Bushido or the invented traditional memory of the samurai? Is it a big one, or what other ingredients go into that?
So there are a lot of different ingredients. I mean, there's some important concepts like the Yamato spirit. Yamato Damashi is one that's brought up quite a bit at the time. I think Bushido specifically becomes very important around that time because you have the Sino-Japanese War in 1894-95, where Japan defeats China, and then 1904-05 you have the Russo-Japanese War, where Japan defeats Russia, and suddenly, I mean, Japan is a major world power, and people are looking for reasons for this success. In the Sino-Japanese War, there's still kind of this idea that, well, Japan just westernized more successfully than China did. Both of them are using ships built, largely in kind of Tyneside. And most of them, well, there's this idea that, yeah, Japan has just westernized more successfully. But then when they defeat Russia, then it's like, well, there must be something else going on. And because these military successes are so important to the national identity at that time, and especially what the government is pushing, I think something like Bushido, this martial ethic, is that much more important. And after the Russo-Japanese War, you see it coming into the education system, both civilian and military education systems. There's a lot of popular culture. There are all sorts of kind of samurai stories going around. This is really when we see also a lot of kind of a ninja boom in the 1910s, where a lot of fiction about ninjas is coming out. And so really, there's this idea that's being spread in the early 20th century that, all Japanese are essentially the descendants of the samurai, and they all need to live in accordance with certain samurai virtues, especially like this absolute loyalty towards now the emperor. They should be frugal, they should be honest. There's all sorts of quite conservative virtues that essentially are used to impose this new ideology on the Japanese people. And I mean, it has to be said, these samurai virtues they are things that, okay, some samurai might have mentioned in the early modern period and before. They certainly weren't universal. It's very comparable to chivalry in that way. I mean, there's this idea of chivalry, but when you actually look at the European medieval period, what chivalry meant to whom is very, very diverse. And I mean, that's something I do like to emphasize actually in just about all of my research, is that most of these dynamics are things we are seeing elsewhere. I mean, especially in Europe and North America, these aren't uniquely Japanese in a lot of ways.
Okay. I'm thinking a lot as well. I'm glad you mentioned that about the idea of crossover, because when you read your bio and everything, and you look at your publications, you expressly state an interest in the crossover. So crossover in discussions and treatments of emotionality. But also, you mentioned earlier on the film Ghost Dog, The Way of the Samurai, which is a Jim Jarmusch film in which Forrest Whitaker plays a very eccentric character who really believes that an old mafia, like a haggard, like a declining mafioso group of old men, aging men. Forrest Whitaker is Ghost Dog and believes that he is the retainer of one of the characters, and basically becomes an assassin for him. So kind of like a ninja who just secretly goes places and assassins. But that film is about nostalgia. It's a nostalgic. It's like there's a declining set of characters and set of figures. The mafia gang are old and they're past their prime and they're weak and their time has passed. And Forrest Whitaker is reading the Hagakure regularly throughout the book. That's what he's meditating on. And the Hagakure itself was a book that was written in the kind of twilight of an era. It's a very nostalgic book about what samurais used to be. And you read it and it's like, in the olden days, people were proper warriors, but now. And so I've been interested in that film as a kind of cross-cultural text, the way we can identify with myths and fantasies of other cultures that produce new identities. And you've written a lot about that kind of thing as well. Could you tell us a bit more about this nostalgic identificatory kind of construction of identity in different ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I mean, that's really at the heart of so much of this, is this kind of nostalgic yearning for, an idealized past that often never existed. And I mean, the Hagakure, as you said, it's a really good example of this. Yamamoto Tsunetomo, who writes this thing, you read it, it kind of starts off with like the way of the warrior is found in death, and it's all death focused, and that it lends itself beautifully to Ghost Dog. It was also, editions were printed and given to soldiers in the Second World War, especially the 1940s, with kind of these choice passages selected for that. The thing is, Yamamoto, he himself, he's living in the late 17th century, and he's thinking about it. He'd never really experienced war. He's thinking about the warfare of the 16th century and the exploits of like the domainal lords in the little domain he was in southwestern Japan. And so he's nostalgically thinking about a period that he never experienced. And even though he's got this great focus on death, I think he dies of old age. I don't know if he was close to his 80s. He kind of retires to a temple, and he didn't go out in a blaze of glory, which you would think when you read his text. And I mean, you look at someone like the author Yukio Mishima, commits suicide in kind of a theatrical failed coup attempt in 1970, I think, in Tokyo. And one of his biggest influences is the Hagakure. There's a wonderful English translation of Mishima's kind of musings on the Hagakure. And I mean, we see what it does in the Second World War, but there is this nostalgia in all these early modern texts, which are now cited so widely, for something that was there before. And it's always looking for some kind of ideal that was there. But when you start looking for that ideal and you start looking at those earlier times, it's almost never there. And it's always referring, when something refers back to a better earlier time, and then you look at that earlier time, it seems that in that earlier time they're also referring back to an even better earlier time, and you keep going back until everything just kind of vanishes in the mists of time.
Yeah. So what about the cross-cultural? I mean, when we once met at a conference in Durham, and we talked a lot about the kind of the transmission of jiu-jitsu and judo around the world. And you opened my eyes to the extent to which you mentioned the ships that were produced, like that were made in Tyneside and then sold around the world and used in different wars and for trade and so on. Tell us about I mean, I could ask about the transmission of judo and jiu-jitsu, but I mean, what has your work focused on in terms of the cross-cultural dimensions? What have you written specifically about?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, one thing, if we're looking kind of an older narrative of Japanese history, which isn't entirely incorrect, but is that, in the late 1860s, 1870s, we have this real kind of rejection of the past and looking towards, ideas of civilization and enlightenment that are coming from the West. And I mean, it's certainly true that Japan is trying to, gather knowledge around the world. There's Japanese missions traveling all around the world, specialists, they're bringing in foreign advisors. And there's this great kind of exchange of ideas going on at the time, which is mainly at that point going from the West to Japan, from the United States and also from Europe to Japan. It's not uncritical one-way traffic, though. And I think one thing that I've really been noticing more and more is how much that's also then kind of traveling the other way. And if we look at something like, I mean, Bushido is a good example there, that, most people in Japan had rejected the samurai. They'd rejected kind of all of that as kind of an unpleasant reminder of the feudal past. But the thing is, when you travel to, let's say, Victorian Britain, Victorian Britain, it's in the middle of this great chivalric revival. Back in Japan in the 1870s, they're tearing down their own castles. But when these diplomatic missions come to London, they're visiting the Queen in a castle. They're touring the Tower of London, which is, this obsolete castle, which is now kind of a military museum. And they're saying, wow, what are they doing here? Why do they have all these obsolete weapons lying around? And then they realize that actually, people are really celebrating this past and like keeping these things around for kind of an educational purpose. And it's really, I think, that realization that they then go back and say, okay, let's stop tearing these castles down. And actually, maybe we don't need to, just scrap everything.
Yeah.
And there's much more of an appreciation, and then an attempt to kind of find parallels. And this is one thing what, I mean, as I argue, where Bushido really comes from, is an attempt to recreate something kind of akin to Victorian gentlemanship.
Okay.
Because, I mean, if we're looking at the late 19th century, the British Empire is the largest empire in the world. There are these very strong ideas that, the British gentleman is essentially, the key to the strength of the empire. And if that can be kind of economic, British merchants, we have these legends about, wars being won on the playing fields of Eton.
Yes.
But one thing we have is this, there's a very strong idea that you can trace the modern gentleman back to the medieval knight and medieval chivalry and knighthood. And in the 1890s, people in Japan start making the same connection, saying, well, wait, we kind of had a feudal knighthood. We can kind of make something like gentlemanship. And they essentially kind of create Bushido. And the original Bushido theories, the first ones that come out in the early 1890s, are very closely mapped onto kind of Victorian ideals. But what I want to highlight here is it while it is kind of going in that direction at the start, soon after the Sino-Japanese War, people in Britain are then looking at Japan and saying, well, actually, wow, that is like a true kind of ancient spirit. We need something like that. And they actually start lamenting how the spirit of knighthood has declined in Britain, but how Japan has managed to retain it over, countless centuries.
Yeah.
And so it's going back and forth. And then if we step across one more to China, for example, in the early 1900s, having now been defeated by Japan, having suffered kind of the Boxer Rebellion, in China, people are now saying, well, actually, we also need to rediscover our ancient martial spirit, and they are now being inspired by both Japan and Europe.
Yeah.
And so this which I think we normally call kind of entangled histories, as these ideas are going all around and kind of reinforcing one another.
Yeah. What was I going to say? I mean, the thing with Japanese arts like the new art of judo, developed by Jigoro Kano, and we tend to easily orientalize that and see it as very like quintessentially Japanese, and it's associated with these Eastern philosophies. But actually Kano was one of these modernizers, wasn't he? Who looked at concepts like Olympic ideals of sporting and decency and formalizing systems and rules and tidying things up. So, but I mean, his relationship with the Western concepts like sport or Western versions of sport was quite complex too, wasn't it? Quite ambivalent about the status of these things that we're appealing to, but we don't want to embrace them entirely because we don't want to sell everything.
Yeah, I mean, Kano is active and I mean incredibly influential at probably the most important period for the martial arts in general. And as you mentioned, I mean, on the one hand, he's kind of recreating this, or almost creating this new sport of judo. Anything with do at the end of it is probably a late 19th century creation. Before that, they were you had jutsu, like you had kenjutsu, you had jujutsu, which is more like arts. And then they kind of decide to make them more deep and philosophical by making them ways or do. So then judo is, kind of the way. But so on the one hand, Kano does have this very strong kind of patriotic movement and trying to do something very national. But on the other hand, I mean, his ideas about, kind of combining these spiritual elements with the physical, this isn't going back to, some Zen master centuries before. He's very heavily influenced by Herbert Spencer, who is now generally kind of seen as kind of the great founder of kind of social Darwinism, so to speak. And that's what really influences Kano. And I mean, a lot of his writings essentially are copying things that Spencer has argued about. And this is something that's very common in Europe as well. I mean, if we look at like the Tolna movement in Germany, that, this kind of the importance of combining the physical with the spiritual
Mm.
or the mental, and that, you know, these physical activities are also ways of self-cultivation.
Mm-hmm.
And Kano really buys into this, and I mean, he contributes a lot to it. But then this is also where we get this whole kind of connection of especially kind of Zen and the martial arts. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, this is essentially a modern invention. I mean, if we go back to the pre-modern period, like this connection of like this, or this idea of kind of the Zen samurai, is a bit of a myth. There are a few texts that have been carefully selected to kind of bolster this, but most of that is essentially a product of the period around kind of 1900.
Mm.
And so, yeah, and that's just another case where, you know, we do have this very interesting interaction between Japan, and especially the West, where then Kano's ideas are becoming very influential in the West. And obviously judo becomes very popular. We have supposedly, you know, Teddy Roosevelt supposedly practicing it. You know, the suffragette movement becoming very interested in it.
Mm-hmm.
And then Zen obviously really takes off in the West as well. I mean, all over Europe and North America.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's people are really recognizing things from their own cultures, I think, in one another's cultures, and then it's kind of this self-reinforcing cycle.
Okay. And finally, I guess castles. I mean, I've never. I mean, everyone likes castles. I think there's this, but I think that you love castles. Like you seem to be. Is it just, or is it not the castles? But is it just that they're so kind of photogenic that you're always posting online about castles because you like your selfie in front of whichever castle you either are visiting or wish you are visiting or have visited or hope to visit in the future. What is it with castles then? What's the castle thing?
Well, yeah, I wish everyone loved castles. But yeah, they I guess a big part of it is just like essentially giving an intellectual historian something with kind of a material visual aspect. And yeah, I just kind of I really like, I guess the aesthetic is very interesting, and I mean obviously the scale of the sites, and I mean they are very very interesting. For me though, more than kind of the details about, you know, how deep the moat is or how thick the walls are, or this and that, I'm really interested in more kind of the public history of the site and the things that aren't actually there anymore often. I mean, if we look at the Japanese case, you know, castles, most of them, they were obsolete actually long before the 1860s. But after the Meiji Restoration, you know, you have these giant fortifications in quite central urban locations, and they decide, well, we don't need them anymore. They tear them down, and they end up essentially putting garrisons of the new Imperial Army in there. I mean, part of this is just pragmatic because, you know, they are creating a new army. They need space for it, and they have these big spaces that have emptied out. What it ends up being is that until 1945, you have massive urban garrisons, and that has a huge impact on Japanese society as a whole in the imperial period, and all the way into the obviously events of the 1930s and 1940s. After 1945, you know, the military is completely disbanded under the American occupation until 1952. The Americans take over a lot of the castles until they leave, but most of the castles are then converted into public spaces. They're turned into parks. They're turned into some universities. Sometimes they're athletic facilities. They put baseball stadiums in them, cycling tracks. And then they start rebuilding a lot of them out of concrete, usually because, I mean, it's the 1950s. Concrete is very durable, and they've just been through a war that, you know, burned down much of the country. So, you know, it makes sense to build out of concrete. So then Japan suddenly is covered in concrete castles. And what these new castles do is, you know, they provide a connection between, you know, the 1950s, 1960s, and the period before the 1860s. In other words, before the empire, and before this kind of problematic 80-year history that kind of ended in disaster for people in Japan and throughout East Asia. After a while, if we go to castles now, like that whole modern history has been completely erased. There are almost no traces of the military anywhere in there. And that's what I quite like about these castles, is going to them and comparing them with the original sites and looking for some of these artifacts. Because if you look carefully, you can still find them. If you know what you're looking for, you will find little memorials. You sometimes will find some bunkers. You will find things that usually aren't signposted or anything else, because the entire focus, like in Europe, is going to be on the medieval period, but they're going to ignore kind of the modern military history. And I mean, I've been working on a little video series about castles recently, and I've got a couple which kind of look at this lost modern history. It's just on YouTube. It's Japan's Modern Castles, if I can throw a plug in there.
Okay, yeah, all right. So it's easy enough to, if we search, what do we search your surname in Japan's Modern Castles, or do we just search?
Yeah, probably just Japan's Modern Castles. It's on my website as well, and I mean, I've got 2 episodes up right now, and the next one should be up at the end of this week or so. But and I mean, oh yeah, see if we actually go to castles. It's probably in or media, either one of those.
There's publications. There's no
other. I think the Japan's. If you go down to the.
There's podcast stuff there, but
and above that, at the top of the other section there, right there.
Okay, got it. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Modern Castles, got it. Yeah. So if we go to olegbenesch.com.
Yeah, and I mean, I just one thing I like to stress with the Castle project as well. I mean, the Castle book, which I wrote together with Ron Zweigenberg at Penn State University, is that these are also very common themes if we look in other countries as well. I mean, these are not uniquely Japanese. If we look at, for example, how I mean, the military has used a lot of castles in the UK in the modern period as well. I mean, it's no coincidence that so many regimental museums now are in castles. Sometimes they will talk about the modern past, sometimes they won't. If we look at like Dover Castle with kind of the huge bunkers and everything underneath that. If we go up to Ripon Castle, which is a very nice ruin, but in there they'll talk about the conscientious objectors in the First World War, who were arrested and sentenced to death. And then they were held in Ripon Castle. And so there's some acknowledgement of the modern past here. And I think in Europe, the modern past of these castles is also very complicated. In Germany, especially, you can imagine. I mean, in a nutshell, National Socialists love castles. But the extent to which that past is actually still visible, or to what extent it's been hidden or kind of purposely erased, I think is fascinating.
Okay, so you're doing videos at the moment about these things. What's the next research project? What are the next publications or any kind?
Well, I guess the main thing I'm working on now is a kind of a larger book project looking at kind of the concept of medievalism more globally, and medievalism. What I mean is the use of medieval symbols and ideas after the medieval period has passed. So essentially, how are medieval symbols used in the modern period? And I mean, this is something I've kind of looked at, obviously in looking at how the samurai have been used in the modern period, how castles have kind of been reinterpreted in the modern period. I mean, these are kind of examples of medievalism. Another one would be, for example, Japanese swords. And I've looked at this in various kind of themes along those lines in the Japanese context, but I'm actually now really interested in kind of a global study of this, because there's been an incredible amount of research on medievalism in Europe. I mean, like the Victorian chivalric revival and such, also in Germany. There's been a lot of research on like American medievalism. We think of Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee at King Arthur's court in the 1880s. He's kind of making fun of the whole medievalist movement in the US. But I'm actually arguing that it's a much broader global thing. If we looked at, I mentioned earlier, diplomats from Japan but also diplomats from China, from Thailand, from everywhere who would be coming to Britain or anywhere in Europe. They are visiting monarchs and rulers in medieval castles.
Mm.
So European medievalism is unavoidable. And we look at some of the colonial buildings that people are building around the world as well. And these are often kind of faux castles. They are, this kind of Gothic revival.
Mm-hmm.
And there is kind of this, I think, global medievalist moment in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And that's really kind of what I'm exploring at the moment. So, hopefully that won't take too much longer, but we'll see.
Do you think that we still live in a kind of medievalist era now, or is it, or would you put it into a different historical frame? Would you say there was a high moment and there's still remnants of it? But
I think it changes, but I think it's still here. There have been peaks. I mean, I think that some people trace it up to the First World War and say in Europe it kind of declined after that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's probably 1945 is a bit more of a watershed. After 1945, I think there's a decline, but I think we've really seen a resurgence of it in the last 30 years. And if we look at some of the debates that have been going on and the resurgence of nationalism in Europe, that has very strongly kind of medievalist connotations, because I mean, one of the things that people are looking for in the medieval period, which it varies a lot depending on which country we're looking at, but the so-called medieval is often where people try to find their national origins. This is when roughly the geographic outlines of what we consider our nation kind of came into being. This is when our language kind of came into being. This is, I mean, if we take England, for example, this is when we start speaking English rather than French. I mean, a lot of Europe, it's like, this is when we start speaking our own language rather than, say, Latin or something else. Whether or not these are accurate, these are the popular ideas today. It's also when people start looking for kind of the origins of their kind of religious groups, for example, like when did our church in our region, actually this denomination, come together? And that will also often be kind of placed in that sort of period. So regardless of the historical accuracy of these things, I think we've seen a huge resurgence of this kind of thinking really all around the West in the last 20, 30 years, especially after the end of the Cold War. And kind of, I remember in the 90s, there was a lot of talk about, and nationalism is now pretty much done and we're moving into something else, but I don't think we would say that now.
Yeah, the end of history.
Yeah. And I mean it's fascinating if we look at also in the United States, we look at some of the events recently and some of the rallies, especially from some of the kind of the right-wing groups. We do see quite a few kind of medieval symbols coming in there. If it's kind of using Viking imagery, for example, that would also be included in there. Crusader imagery would be another kind of aspect of medievalism in the West, so to speak. Whereas in Japan, it's things like samurai that fulfill that role.
Okay, that's absolutely fascinating. I've never really thought about it in those terms, but I mean, there's so much interesting stuff. But we've talked for a while now, so I am going to say, Oleg Benesch, thank you ever so much for taking the time to talk to me. It was great.
No, thanks a lot, Paul. It's great to catch up again.